An old family picture from 1890 reveals a terrifying detail when zoomed in. What begins as an innocent dive into family history often uncovers secrets long buried in the shadows of time. The past is never truly gone, especially when it stares back at you from behind yellowed photographic paper. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Rebecca Martinez hesitated at the threshold of the Whitmore mansion, her fingers lingering on the weathered brass doorknob. The autumn wind pushed at her back, almost urging her forward into the forgotten residence. As an antique shop owner with years of experience handling historical pieces, she'd visited countless abandoned homes. But something about this place sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the October breeze. The heavy oak door creaked closed behind her with an ominous thud, stirring decades of dust into lazy spirals that danced in the thin shafts of light piercing through the grimy windows. Rebecca pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders, her boots leaving clear imprints in the thick layer of dust covering the marble floor. "Hello!" she called out, her voice swallowed by the vastness of the entrance hall. No answer came, only the settling of the old house around her. The silence pressed against her eardrums, broken only by her quickening heartbeat and the occasional groan of ancient timbers. Rebecca moved deeper into the mansion, drawn forward by professional curiosity and something else, an inexplicable pull she couldn't quite name. That's when she saw it, hanging slightly askew on the far wall, an ornate gold-leafed frame containing what appeared to be a family portrait. Unlike the other furnishings draped in cobwebs and grime, something about this photograph commanded attention. Despite its glass being frosted with decades of neglect, Rebecca approached slowly, removing a small flashlight from her pocket. The beam illuminated the image, revealing 5 figures arranged in a formal Victorian pose. The details emerged gradually as she wiped away a thin layer of dust with her handkerchief. 3 children sitting rigidly in the foreground, their small faces unnaturally stiff. A woman standing behind them, her trembling hand barely resting on her son's shoulder, and beside her, a man, presumably Edmund Whitmore, whose hollow eyes betrayed exhaustion and unmistakable fear. "What happened to you?" she whispered, studying the patriarch's face. The antique dealer leaned closer, noticing how the children's expressions seemed frozen in quiet terror rather than the usual stoic formality of period photographs. The mother's posture was slightly hunched, as if physically restraining herself from fleeing the scene. Something about their collective gaze seemed to follow Rebecca as she shifted position, creating the unsettling impression that the family was silently watching her, perhaps even trying to communicate across the century that separated them. Without fully understanding why, Rebecca carefully removed the portrait from the wall. This photograph didn't belong in this abandoned house any longer. It held secrets. She was certain of it, and she was determined to uncover them. Rebecca Martinez locked the door of her antique shop on Beacon Hill, the afternoon light streaming through the dusty windows as she carefully placed the Whitmore portrait on her restoration table. The mahogany workspace, worn smooth from years of careful repairs, seemed to welcome this new mystery. She pulled on cotton gloves, unwilling to risk damaging the century-old photograph with the oils from her fingertips. As she gently wiped away decades of grime with a specialized cloth, Rebecca was struck by the photograph's exceptional clarity. Victorian-era portraits were rarely this sharp, this detailed. The antique dealer had worked with hundreds of historical photographs, but something about this image felt different, almost as if it had been preserved with unusual care, or perhaps unusual purpose. "This is remarkable," she whispered to herself, leaning closer. The more dust she removed, the more unsettling details emerged. The children's formal attire was noticeably disheveled, collars askew, fabric bunched at the shoulders as if the clothing had been hastily pulled on. Edmund Whitmore's expression, stern yet hollow, drew her attention to his wrists, where faint dark lines circled just beneath his cuffs. Rebecca reached for her brass magnifying glass, a tool she'd inherited from her grandfather. The cool metal felt reassuring in her hand as she methodically examined each corner of the image. The family's forced smiles became grimaces under magnification, their eyes wide with what she now recognized as unmistakable fear. Then she saw it. In the background, partially visible in an ornate mirror hanging on the wall behind the family, were shadows that didn't belong, not random blurs or photographic imperfections, but distinct human silhouettes. 3 figures stood motionless, watching the family from across the room. They weren't included in the portrait's framing, yet the mirror had captured their presence. "My God," she breathed, adjusting the magnifying glass to focus more clearly. Each shadow figure clutched something in their hands, thick, coiled objects that hung at their sides. Ropes, twisted ropes. Rebecca set down her tools with trembling hands. The Whitmore family hadn't posed for a celebratory portrait. They'd been forced to sit for this photograph, with their captors standing just out of frame. The father's wrist marks weren't shadows but bruises or rope burns. The children's rumpled clothing told of struggle or hasty preparation. She stepped back from her workbench, suddenly aware of her rapid breathing. This wasn't just an antique, it was evidence. The portrait wasn't merely a family heirloom, it was a silent witness to something terrible that had happened in that Boston mansion over 100 years ago. Rebecca knew she needed help to unravel this mystery. She reached for her phone to call James Harrison, the historian whose expertise in Victorian artifacts might make sense of what she'd discovered. Rebecca Martinez's hands trembled as she reached for her smartphone. She needed expertise beyond her own knowledge of antiques. James Harrison was the obvious choice, a historian whose meticulous attention to Victorian artifacts had earned him respect throughout Boston's academic circles. "James, I've found something unsettling," she explained, her voice unsteady as she described the photograph. The historian agreed to come first thing in the morning. Rebecca barely slept that night. The shadowy figures from the portrait's reflection haunted her dreams. By the time James arrived at her antique shop, she had already set up a workspace with proper lighting and her best magnifying glass. "This is quite remarkable," James murmured, adjusting his glasses as he leaned over the photograph. His fingers, weathered from years of handling delicate historical documents, hovered just above the surface without touching it. The historian methodically examined each element. First the children's clothing, noting their formal but hastily arranged appearance. Then the strained expressions frozen in time. "Look at Edmund Whitmore's wrists," he said, pointing carefully. "Those marks aren't decorative cufflinks, they're bruises, possibly rope burns." Rebecca nodded, having noticed the same detail. "What about the mother?" James shifted his attention to Margaret Whitmore. "Her sleeves are uneven, as if her dress was put on hurriedly, and her posture—" He paused, tracing the outline in the air. No Victorian woman would voluntarily stand at such an angle for a formal portrait. Her spine is twisted slightly, like someone is holding her in place just out of frame. The shop fell silent as they both processed the implications. Outside, Boston traffic continued its normal rhythm, oblivious to the century-old tragedy unfolding under their scrutiny. "This is authentic," James finally declared, his voice shaking slightly. "The photographic technique, the clothing details, all consistent with the period, but this isn't a normal family portrait. These people were under duress." Rebecca felt a chill despite the warm spring air filtering through the shop's windows. "The figures in the mirror's reflection—" "Yes," the historian interrupted, his face pale. "I believe they were the ones applying that duress. Notice how the family is positioned. They're not arranged for aesthetic purposes, but to all be visible in one frame. Like documentation. Documentation of what? Rebecca asked, though part of her already knew the answer. James Harrison met her eyes with a grim expression. Their last moments together as a family, I fear. This photograph wasn't a memento. It was a warning. Rebecca Martinez and James Harrison spent 3 days buried in the Boston Historical Archives, their fingers coated with the fine dust of forgotten records. The basement room smelled of old paper and mildew, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights that made Rebecca's eyes ache as she pored over century-old documents. "I found something," James whispered, his voice carrying across the silent room. The historian slid a yellowed newspaper toward her, pointing to a small article dated November 14th, 1891. The headline read, "Whitmore family departure raises questions." Rebecca leaned closer, her heart quickening. The article described how Edmund Whitmore, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children had abruptly left their Boston residence without notifying neighbors or business associates. The reporter noted the peculiar circumstances surrounding their departure, as servants arrived to find the house unlocked but completely empty. "Look at this," James said, producing another clipping. Edmund's textile business was failing. He'd borrowed heavily from Blackwood Financial Group. He tapped the name with his finger. "I've seen this name before. They were connected to several prominent disappearances during that era." The pair discovered a pattern in subsequent articles. Edmund Whitmore had been desperately seeking investors in the months before vanishing. His name appeared alongside increasingly desperate financial notices, culminating in a formal declaration of bankruptcy proceedings filed the day after the family portrait was taken. "These men weren't just creditors," Rebecca murmured, examining a business directory that listed the Blackwood partners. They practically owned half of New England, politicians, judges, newspaper owners, all in their pocket. James nodded grimly. "Dan, look here." He pushed forward a society column that mentioned Edmund attending a charity function, looking uncharacteristically distressed, and departing early after a brief conversation with 2 gentlemen described as representatives of financial interests. Most telling was what they couldn't find any record of the Whitmores after the portrait date. No travel documents, no property transfers, no death certificates. The entire household had simply vanished, leaving behind only debts and whispers. "The children," Rebecca said softly, thinking of the young faces in the photograph. "There's not a single record of what happened to them." As they packed up their notes that evening, James placed a gentle hand on Rebecca's shoulder. "We're dealing with something darker than just an unusual photograph," he said. "These weren't just debts. These were dangerous men who made people disappear." Rebecca nodded, her determination hardening. "And they never expected anyone would still be looking 100 years later." James Harrison paced across the worn floorboards of Rebecca's antique shop, his mind racing with historical implications. The Whitmore photograph had consumed his thoughts since first seeing it. As a historian specializing in Victorian artifacts, he recognized the signs of something deeply troubling captured in that image. "I know someone who might help us," James said, reaching for his smartphone. "Sarah Chen. She's a detective with the Boston PD who specializes in cold cases. If anyone can make sense of this, it's her." Rebecca nodded eagerly. "The detective who solved the Harbor Bridge disappearances? Perfect." The following afternoon, Sarah Chen arrived at the shop, her analytical gaze immediately drawn to the photograph. The detective's reputation preceded her, methodical, relentless, with an uncanny ability to see connections others missed. "This is over 100 years old," Sarah observed, studying the portrait through narrowed eyes. "But a crime doesn't expire just because the victims are gone." Together, the 3 formed an unlikely investigative team. Sarah suggested submitting the photograph for digital enhancement at the police department's forensic lab. 2 days later, they huddled around a computer screen as the technician pulled up the results. "I've enhanced the reflection in the mirror," the technician explained, zooming into the background. "There's definitely something there." The image sharpened with each adjustment. What had appeared as mere shadows in the original photograph now resolved into distinct human forms. 4 figures stood behind the photographer, their faces grim and expressionless. Most disturbing were the objects in their hands, thick, coiled ropes that hung ominously at their sides. Those aren't photographic anomalies," Sarah whispered, her professional composure momentarily shaken. Rebecca gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. They were being held captive when this was taken. James leaned closer to the screen, his academic detachment giving way to horror. "Look at their eyes," he said, pointing to the reflection. "They're staring directly at the camera. They wanted to be seen." Sarah's detective instincts kicked in immediately. This wasn't just a family portrait. It was documentation, evidence of whatever was about to happen to the Whitmores. A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications sank in. The photograph wasn't merely an antique curiosity. It was a silent witness to a century-old crime. The Whitmore family hadn't simply disappeared. They had been taken, their final moments preserved in silver nitrate and paper. "We need to find out who those men were," Rebecca said finally. Breaking the silence, Sarah nodded, her determination evident. "And what happened after this photograph was taken?" The 3 exchanged glances, united by a shared purpose. What had begun as historical curiosity had transformed into something far more urgent, a quest for justice long overdue. Sarah Chen leaned over the photograph, her detective instincts fully engaged. After 15 years solving cold cases, she knew that physical evidence often revealed secrets that witnesses couldn't or wouldn't share. "The paper's unusual," she observed, gloved fingers carefully testing its thickness. Victorian photographs typically used thinner stock. "This is almost twice as heavy." Rebecca and James exchanged glances as Sarah Chen examined the wooden frame, her experienced eyes noticing what they had missed. The detective pointed to barely perceptible gouges along the edges. "Someone opened this frame and resealed it, probably decades ago," she explained. "See these marks? They're tool impressions. Whoever did this was careful, but in a hurry." James Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "That aligns with what we know about Edmund Whitmore's financial troubles. Perhaps someone concealed evidence within the photograph itself." The trio moved to Rebecca's workbench, where specialized equipment waited. Sarah placed the photograph under an ultraviolet light she'd brought from the department's forensic lab. The purple glow transformed the image, revealing previously invisible details. "Look there," Rebecca gasped, pointing to the ornate sideboard visible behind the family. On the reflective surface, faint scratches emerged under the UV light, deliberate marks nearly invisible to the naked eye. As they adjusted the angle, the scratches formed 2 unmistakable words: "Help us." "Someone in that room was desperate enough to leave a message," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "Probably Margaret Whitmore or one of the children." James leaned closer, adjusting his glasses. The photographer, Marcus Crane, must have known. He preserved this evidence deliberately. Rebecca felt a chill run through her body. The antique shop owner had handled countless historical items, but never one carrying such a desperate plea across time. The scratches had been made with something small, perhaps a hairpin or jewelry clasp, while the intimidating figures were distracted. "This changes everything," Sarah said, straightening up. "This isn't just a historical curiosity anymore. It's evidence of a crime, multiple crimes, potentially." The detective carefully documented everything with her smartphone, creating a visual record. The scratched message transformed their academic investigation into something far more urgent, a century-old cry for help that demanded justice. "Whoever made these marks knew the photograph might survive even if they didn't," James said quietly. Rebecca nodded, her determination growing, and they were right. "We're listening now." Rebecca Martinez spread the evidence across her antique shop's oak table as Sarah Chen and James Harrison huddled around. The three investigators had been piecing together the puzzle for days, reconstructing the events that led to the Whitmore family's chilling portrait. "Look at these newspaper clippings," James said, adjusting his glasses. The historian carefully arranged yellowed articles chronicling Boston's artistic scene from the early 1900s. Marcus Crane wasn't just any photographer. He was celebrated for his innovative techniques and emotional depth. Sarah nodded. Examining a faded advertisement for Crane's studio, his portraits commanded top dollar from Boston's elite. The lighting in the Whitmore photograph shows his signature style, dramatic shadows that reveal as much as they conceal. But his success was built on quicksand, Rebecca added, producing financial records she'd obtained from the Historical Society. The documents revealed a man drowning in gambling debts, borrowing from increasingly dangerous lenders to maintain his lifestyle and studio. The detective tapped her finger on a ledger entry. "His debts accelerated just months before the Whitmore session. The timing can't be coincidental." James carefully extracted a brittle notebook from an archival box, the diary of Elizabeth Crane, the photographer's wife. The trio had discovered it buried among estate papers during their research at the university archives. "Listen to this entry," he said, voice dropping. "Marcus returned past midnight again. His hands shook so badly he couldn't unlock our door. When I asked about the men who'd visited earlier, he begged me never to mention them again." Rebecca felt a chill as Sarah read another passage aloud. "Today, Marcus prepared his equipment with such care, yet tears streamed down his face. He said only that tomorrow's portrait session was not his choice, and that we must pray for the Whitmores." The final entries were most disturbing. Elizabeth wrote of strange men watching their home, of threats whispered when she shopped at the market, of her husband's growing terror. "His professional record stopped completely after the Whitmore session," James noted, pointing to the abrupt end of appointment books and financial ledgers. "No more clients, no more photographs." Sarah connected the threads with the detective's precision. And the same men who pressured Edmund Whitmore clearly forced Crane to document whatever happened to the family. He wasn't just a photographer that day, he was a witness. "Or an unwilling accomplice," Rebecca whispered, studying the portrait again. "Look at the angle, slightly askew, as if his hands were unsteady. He knew what was happening behind him." The trio exchanged grim glances. The photographer's story mirrored the Whitmores' own, another family terrorized by shadowy creditors whose influence stretched across Boston like a spider's web. Marcus Crane wasn't just taking a portrait, James concluded solemnly. He was creating evidence. Sarah Chen spread dozens of files across the table at Rebecca's antique shop. Her methodical approach had uncovered a disturbing pattern that stretched back over a century. The detective had spent 3 sleepless nights combing through Boston's historical records, connecting seemingly unrelated disappearances to the same group of creditors. "Look at this," Sarah pointed to a yellowed newspaper clipping. "The Harrington family, 1904, vanished after their business collapsed, and here," she slid another document forward, "the Winslow household, 1912. Both families were indebted to the same financial group that hounded Edmund Whitmore." Rebecca Martinez leaned closer, her fingers tracing the names. "The same people who were reflected in the mirror." "Exactly," the detective nodded. I've found 7 families so far, all wealthy, all suddenly gone, all connected to these shadow financiers. They didn't just collect debts, they collected people. James Harrison adjusted his glasses. Examining the timeline Sarah had constructed, the pattern is unmistakable. These creditors operated with impunity, erasing entire bloodlines when payments couldn't be made. While Sarah and James discussed the legal implications, Rebecca returned to the photograph, something nagging at her trained eye. She placed it under her shop's antique brass magnifying glass, focusing on details she'd previously overlooked. "The children," she whispered, interrupting the others. "Their shoes don't match their formal clothes." The historian moved beside her, squinting at the image. "You're right. The boy is wearing what appear to be everyday boots, not dress shoes. And look at their hair," Rebecca continued, her voice tightening. "It's barely combed, nothing like the meticulous styling typical of formal Victorian portraits." Sarah joined them, her detective's eye catching additional discrepancies. The daughter's collar is buttoned incorrectly. And the son's jacket, it's too large for him, like it was grabbed in haste. They were forced to dress quickly, Rebecca concluded, her stomach knotting. Probably at gunpoint, judging by their expressions. James nodded grimly. The Whitmore family wasn't posing for a keepsake. They were documenting their final moments. The trio fell silent, the weight of realization settling over them. These weren't just historical curiosities or academic puzzles. They were looking at evidence of crimes, at families whose terror had been preserved on paper and forgotten by time. "We need to keep digging," Sarah finally said, her resolve hardening. These weren't isolated incidents. This was systematic. Rebecca glanced again at the children's mismatched shoes, her heart aching for their fear on that long-ago morning. "They tried to tell us," she murmured. "Even then, they were leaving clues." James Harrison hunched over stacks of yellowed papers at the Boston Historical Society, his fingers tracing property records from the early 1900s. With each document, the historian's suspicions grew. Wherever the creditors' names appeared, Blackwood, Harrington and Thorne, strange inconsistencies followed. Properties changed hands without proper documentation. Census records showed inexplicable gaps. And entire family lines simply vanished from public record. "It's as if someone deliberately obscured the paper trail," James muttered to Rebecca, who sat across from him, examining tax records. "Look at this. The Whitmore property was transferred to Harrington Holdings just 3 days after the photograph was taken, with no sale price listed." Rebecca Martinez nodded grimly. "And the neighbors. Nothing from them either." "That's what's most disturbing," James replied. Removing his reading glasses, "I've reviewed interviews conducted in the 1950s with people who lived on the same street. They all claim complete ignorance about what happened to the Whitmores. One woman actually ended the interview when pressed." The historian's eyes reflected a mixture of fascination and dread. The fear lingered for generations. Whatever happened to the Whitmores wasn't just forgotten, it was deliberately not spoken about. Meanwhile, Sarah Chen had returned to the mansion, drawn by a detail in the architectural plans she'd discovered in city records. The detective moved methodically through the library, tapping walls and measuring distances between bookcases. The plans had shown an unusual gap between the library's outer dimensions and its interior space. "There has to be something here," she whispered to herself, running her fingers along the ornate wooden paneling. When her knuckles rapped against a section behind the third bookcase, the hollow sound confirmed her suspicions. After 20 minutes of careful examination, Sarah found the trigger mechanism, a decorative rosette that, when pressed and turned, released a hidden catch. The panel slid open with a groan of ancient wood, revealing a space no larger than a bread box. Inside lay a package wrapped in oilcloth, preserved from decades of dust and decay. Sarah's heart raced as she carefully unwrapped it, revealing a leather-bound book with M.W. embossed on its cover. Margaret Whitmore's diary. The detective handled the brittle pages with reverence, skimming entries that began cheerfully enough. Descriptions of Boston society events, children's milestones, household matters. But as the dates approached the time of the photograph, the tone changed dramatically. Sarah pulled out her phone and called Rebecca immediately. "I found it," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "Margaret Whitmore's diary. And from what I'm seeing, our worst suspicions were right. The diary would finally give voice to a family silenced for over a century." The pages of Margaret Whitmore's diary trembled in Sarah Chen's hands as she carefully turned each brittle leaf. The detective's voice grew softer with each passage she read aloud, the weight of a century-old terror filling Rebecca's antique shop. April 3rd. 1890 A. Sarah read. Edmund returned past midnight again, his eyes hollow, hands shaking. He will not speak of his meetings, but I heard him weeping in his study. She looked up at her companions, their faces illuminated by the soft lamplight. Rebecca Martinez leaned forward, her fingers instinctively reaching toward the diary as if to touch the pain inscribed there. James Harrison stood motionless by the window, his scholarly demeanor giving way to visible distress. "And nay, the entries grow more desperate," the detective continued. "Margaret writes about strangers watching the house, about Edmund burning papers late into the night." Sarah turned another page. She mentions men arriving unannounced, speaking to her husband in hushed tones that made the children hide behind her skirts. James moved closer. The financial troubles Edmund faced, they weren't just business difficulties. "No," Sarah confirmed. "Listen to this. They came again tonight. Edmund says we must do as they ask. He speaks of terrible consequences if we refuse." Rebecca glanced at the photograph resting on her workbench. The faces of the Whitmore family now seemed transformed, not formal or composed, but frozen in quiet terror. "The final entry," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The morning of the portrait. They arrived at dawn. 4 men. Edmund was made to wake the children. They watched as we dressed. Mary crying, little Thomas too frightened to speak. Edmund whispered to me that we must smile, must look natural. The photographer seemed as afraid as we were. I saw the ropes in their hands. God help us all." Silence filled the shop as Sarah closed the diary. The trio exchanged glances, the horror of Margaret's words hanging between them. "The photograph wasn't commemorating anything," Rebecca finally said. "It was documenting their captivity." James nodded grimly. "Look at their posture again, the mother's uneven sleeves, the children's disheveled appearance. They were dressed in haste, under duress. And the reflection in the mirror," Sarah added. "Those weren't shadows or photographic errors. They were the creditors, standing just out of the main frame." Rebecca approached the photograph once more, seeing it with new understanding. The stiff poses, the fearful eyes. This wasn't merely a family portrait. It was evidence of the last moments before the Whitmores vanished, a visual testament to their terror preserved for over 100 years. "We need to find out what happened after this picture was taken," Rebecca said firmly. "They deserve that much." The Boston Historical Society's main hall buzzed with anticipation as Rebecca Martinez placed Margaret Whitmore's diary on the podium. Flanked by James Harrison and Detective Sarah Chen, she faced a crowd of journalists, academics, and curious citizens. The projector illuminated the haunting family portrait behind them, its details now magnified to reveal the shadowy figures with ropes. "What we've uncovered isn't just a historical curiosity," Rebecca explained, her voice steady despite her racing heart. It's evidence of a systematic campaign of intimidation and likely murder that has been buried for over a century. James stepped forward, adjusting his glasses as he detailed the historical context. The historian's methodical presentation connected the Whitmore family's disappearance to similar cases across New England, all linked to the same network of creditors. When he read excerpts from Margaret's diary, a hush fell over the room. The response was immediate and polarizing. Representatives from Boston's oldest families rose in outrage, their faces flushed with indignation. A silver-haired man in an expensive suit declared the findings preposterous slander against pillars of the community. 3 others walked out, whispering furiously into their smartphones. "My great-grandfather was a businessman, not a monster," insisted Elizabeth Harrington, whose ancestor's name appeared repeatedly in Margaret's accounts. This diary could be a clever forgery. "Where's your proof?" Sarah Chen, unfazed by the hostility, presented the forensic evidence. The detective's calm demeanor commanded attention as she explained how the paper's chemical composition dated precisely to 1890, how the handwriting matched other known samples of Margaret's penmanship, and how the hidden message scratched into the furniture had been verified by 3 independent experts. "The evidence speaks for itself," Sarah concluded, meeting Elizabeth's gaze directly. Academic skeptics raised valid questions about methodology and interpretation, but even they couldn't dismiss the mounting evidence. Professor Daniels from Boston University, initially one of the most vocal critics, examined the diary with a magnifying glass before reluctantly nodding. "The historical consistency is remarkable," he admitted. "The details about daily life, the specific references to events we can verify independently, it would be nearly impossible to fabricate with this level of accuracy." As the presentation concluded, Rebecca noticed a young woman at the back of the room, clutching a folder to her chest. Their eyes met briefly before the stranger slipped away. Outside, reporters surrounded the trio, cameras flashing as they demanded statements. "We're not making accusations without evidence," Rebecca told them firmly. "We're simply asking that history acknowledge what happened to the Whitmore family and others like them. Their story deserves to be told." That night, as the first newspaper headlines appeared online, Rebecca knew there was no turning back. The truth, hidden for generations, had finally begun its journey into the light. As the investigation gained momentum, Rebecca found herself spending late nights at the Historical Society, poring over boxes of yellowed legal documents. Her dedication paid off when she discovered a brittle envelope tucked between property deeds from 1891. Inside was a letter that made her hands tremble. "James, Sarah, you need to see this now," Rebecca Martinez said, her voice barely above a whisper, as she called her colleagues. Within the hour, the historian and detective had joined her at the antique shop. The letter, written in a shaky hand, was from Marcus Crane to his wife. The photographer's words were desperate, each sentence betraying a man terrified for his family's safety. "My dearest Elizabeth, if this reaches you, take the children and flee west. Do not wait for me. The men who own everything have made it clear what happens to those who witness their methods. The Whitmore portrait was not the first, nor will it be the last. This changes everything," James said, adjusting his glasses as he examined the fragile paper. Crane wasn't just a photographer hired for a family portrait. He was another victim. Sarah Chen nodded grimly. "The timeline matches perfectly. Crane disappeared 3 days after the Whitmore family. No body was ever found, no investigation conducted." The detective pulled out her notebook, adding this crucial detail to their growing web of evidence. Rebecca carefully placed the letter under her magnifying glass. "Look at this postscript." She pointed to faded words at the bottom. He mentions similar arrangements for the Prescott and Harrington families. Both were wealthy Boston families who reportedly moved away suddenly. Or disappeared, James added, his scholarly demeanor giving way to quiet anger. The trio sat in silence, contemplating the implications. Marcus Crane had likely been eliminated by the same shadowy creditors who had taken the Whitmores. His photography skills had made him useful for documenting their victims, perhaps as proof for other associates, but his knowledge made him dangerous. He knew too much, Sarah said finally. These men didn't just erase debts, they erased entire families and anyone connected to them. Rebecca stared at the portrait hanging on her wall, seeing it with new eyes. Crane wasn't just forced to take the picture, he was trying to leave evidence. That's why he positioned the family where the mirror would capture those figures in the background. The photographer's fate now seemed tragically clear. His silence had been purchased not with money, but with blood. As the trio added this revelation to their growing case, they realized how deep the conspiracy truly ran, and how dangerous their pursuit of justice had become. Sarah Chen couldn't sleep. The faces from the Whitmore portrait haunted her dreams, not just the family's expressions of quiet terror, but those shadowy figures lurking in the mirror's reflection. In her apartment, surrounded by case files, the detective methodically constructed a timeline on her living room wall. Yellow string connected photographs of families to their creditors, creating a web of victims spanning nearly a century. It's the same pattern every time, she explained when Rebecca Martinez and James Harrison joined her the next morning. Sarah pointed to the clusters of string. A family falls into debt, then intimidation begins. Shortly after, they disappear completely. Their homes stand empty. No death certificates, no relocation records, just silence. James nodded grimly, adjusting his glasses as he examined her work. And the creditors acquire their assets through shell companies or distant relatives. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. I've identified 27 families with identical patterns. The Whitmores weren't the first victims, nor the last. Meanwhile, Rebecca had become consumed with the physical construction of the portrait itself. Back at her antique shop, she carefully examined the frame under her desk lamp. The historian had mentioned that Victorian photographs often contained hidden compartments, secrets within secrets. The backing seems thicker than normal, Rebecca muttered to herself, gently working her fingers along the edges. After hours of delicate manipulation, she managed to separate the layers of photographic paper without damaging the image. Her heart nearly stopped when something fluttered out, a yellowed slip of paper no larger than a playing card. Written in cramped, desperate handwriting was a list, names, dates and sums. The ink had faded to a rusty brown, but remained legible. Edmund Whitmore, March 1890, $7,500. Thomas Aldridge, November 1889, $4,200. Catherine Winslow, February 1891, $6,800. The list continued, 12 names in total. Rebecca's hands trembled as she realized what she was holding. A ledger of victims, hidden by someone who feared for their life but couldn't bear to let the truth disappear. When she called Sarah and James, her voice shook with excitement and dread. I found something inside the portrait, a list of names, dates, and debts. Marcus Crane must have hidden it there, a final act of defiance against the men who forced him to document their crimes. This changes everything, James said, his academic reserve cracking with emotion. We have physical evidence linking multiple families to the same creditors. Sarah's voice was steely with determination. And I have case files for each of these names. We're not just looking at one family's tragedy anymore. We're looking at a century of orchestrated disappearances, Rebecca finished, staring at the frantic handwriting of a man who knew too much. James Harrison's hands trembled as he cross-referenced the names from the hidden list with his research database. The historian's meticulous nature served him well as patterns emerged. Each name on the fragile paper matched families whose Boston estates had remained conspicuously vacant for generations. "Rebecca, look at this," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "The Caldwells, the Prestons, the Harringtons, all these families disappeared within months of each other in 1903. He pointed to the dates scrawled beside each name, the ink faded but legible. And every single one of them had financial ties to the same creditors as Edmund Whitmore. Rebecca Martinez leaned closer, her antique shop's desk lamp casting long shadows across the documents. So the photograph wasn't just documenting the Whitmores' final moments, she murmured. It was a trophy, evidence of what happened when people couldn't pay their debts. "More than that," Sarah Chen interjected, setting down her coffee. "It was a warning. These creditors kept physical proof of their intimidation tactics to show other potential victims what awaited them if they stepped out of line." The Boston Globe ran the story the following morning. By afternoon, 3 television crews had set up outside Rebecca's shop, and her phone buzzed constantly with interview requests. The university history department, sensing the academic significance, hastily organized a symposium that filled their largest lecture hall to capacity. The event quickly became charged with emotion. In the front row sat elderly men and women, distant relatives of the families on the list, many learning for the first time what had happened to their ancestors. Behind them, representatives from Boston's oldest banking families shifted uncomfortably, their lawyers whispering urgently in their ears. "My great-grandfather didn't simply move west, as we were told," one woman declared, tears streaming down her face. "He was murdered for his debts, and his children were—" Her voice broke as she gestured toward the enlarged photograph projected on the screen. A silver-haired man in an expensive suit stood up. "These accusations are preposterous. My family built this city's financial foundation. We won't stand for this historical slander." James stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "Sir, we have the evidence right here. Your great-grandfather's signature appears on documents threatening the Whitmore family just days before they vanished." The room erupted in shouting. Rebecca watched as centuries of buried truths surfaced like bodies in a flood. Sarah quietly documented each reaction, noting which modern families seemed most defensive. The detective recognized the telltale signs of guilt, the same expressions she'd seen in countless interrogation rooms. As the symposium dissolved into chaos, Rebecca realized they had uncovered something far larger than a single family's tragedy. They had exposed the dark foundation upon which Boston's gilded society had been built. The storm broke with the fury of a Boston nor'easter. Within 48 hours of their public presentation, Rebecca Martinez found herself at the center of a media cyclone. 3 separate law firms representing Boston's oldest families had issued cease and desist letters, demanding she surrender the Whitmore photograph and all related materials. "They're scared," James Harrison remarked, spreading the legal documents across Rebecca's antique shop counter. "These threats only validate what we've found." Sarah Chen nodded grimly as she examined the letters. Classic intimidation tactics. The same playbook, just modernized. The detective had seen similar patterns in her cold cases, powerful interests using legal machinery to bury inconvenient truths. The Boston Herald ran a front-page story questioning the trio's credentials and methods. Anonymous sources claimed the photograph had been doctored, the diary forged. Rebecca watched with growing disbelief as television commentators debated her integrity rather than addressing the evidence. "They offered me 6 figures yesterday," Rebecca confessed one evening as the 3 huddled in her shop after hours. Dern, a man in an expensive suit, said it would be easier for everyone if this unfortunate misunderstanding went away. James nearly knocked over his coffee. "You didn't tell us." "Because I never considered it," she replied, her voice steady despite the dark circles under her eyes. "This isn't about money. It's about what happened to the Whitmores, to Marcus Crane, to all those families. Their trifecta of evidence proved unassailable. The photograph's authenticity had been verified by 3 independent experts. Margaret Whitmore's diary contained details about Boston society that only an insider could have known. And the list, that damning list of names, dates, and debts, corresponded perfectly with property records and mysterious disappearances. Anonymous calls came at night. Rebecca's shop window was smashed one Tuesday morning. Sarah found her car tires slashed after meeting with a police commissioner about reopening related cases. "They're using the same tactics their ancestors did," Sarah observed, "just without the ropes." Yet public opinion was shifting. Former employees of the implicated families began coming forward with stories of strange traditions, locked rooms, and warnings about family matters that must never be discussed. Rebecca stood at her shop window one evening, watching rain streak the glass. The portrait of the Whitmore family sat on her restoration table, the frightened eyes of the children catching the lamplight. "We can't stop now," she whispered, more to herself than to James, who stood beside her. "Not when we're their only voice." The historian placed a supportive hand on her shoulder. "We won't," he promised. "History deserves the truth. The silence deserved justice." The weight of their discovery pressed down on the trio like a physical burden. Rebecca Martinez hadn't slept properly in weeks, dark circles forming beneath her eyes as she pored over documents late into the night. The photograph haunted her dreams when she did manage to rest. Despite the exhaustion, they pushed forward. Sarah Chen's determination only intensified as threats began arriving at her office. The detective leveraged her reputation within the Boston Police Department, convincing skeptical colleagues to re-examine cold cases connected to the creditor's descendants. Her badge became both shield and sword as she navigated the bureaucracy. "These families didn't just vanish," Sarah explained during a tense meeting with her captain. "They were systematically erased, and the people responsible built empires on their silence." The captain initially hesitated, aware of the powerful names involved. "These are some of Boston's most influential citizens. Chen, the Harrington Financial Group alone, employs thousands. And their fortune began with blood money," Sarah replied, sliding Margaret Whitmore's diary across the desk. "Justice doesn't expire." Meanwhile, James Harrison worked feverishly at his university office, connecting historical dots that painted a damning picture. The historian compiled evidence showing how the creditors had seized properties, consolidated wealth, and systematically removed any trace of their victims from public records. His article, "The Architecture of Silence: How Boston's Elite Built Fortunes on Forgotten Crimes," was submitted to the Journal of American History. "They'll try to bury this," his department chair warned when James shared an advance copy. "They've been burying things for a century," James responded. "And that ends now." The publication ignited academic circles like wildfire. Historians and sociologists across New England contacted James with corroborating evidence from their own research. 3 prestigious universities launched ethics investigations into buildings named after the implicated families. Rebecca coordinated their efforts from her antique shop, which had become an unofficial headquarters. The small business owner fielded calls from journalists and organized the mounting evidence. When a black sedan lingered outside her store for 3 consecutive days, she simply photographed it and posted the image online with the caption, "Still watching, still not afraid." The pressure mounted from all sides. Anonymous callers offered substantial sums for their silence. Legal threats arrived by certified mail. But with each attempt to silence them, the trio's resolve hardened. "And they don't understand," Rebecca told her partners over coffee one morning. "The Whitmores couldn't speak, Marcus Crane couldn't speak, but we can, and we will." The truth, so long contained, was finally breaking free. The Boston Historical Society's auditorium buzzed with tension as Rebecca Martinez stood at the podium facing Charles Blackwood, the silver-haired heir to one of the city's oldest fortunes. Camera flashes punctuated the silence as journalists documented this unprecedented confrontation between an antique shop owner and one of New England's elite. "Mr. Blackwood, your great-grandfather's name appears repeatedly in the evidence we've uncovered," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She gestured to the enlarged photograph projected behind her. The Whitmore family's haunted faces, now familiar to everyone in Boston. Blackwood adjusted his tailored suit, a dismissive smile playing at his lips. "Old debts and business arrangements are hardly newsworthy, Miss Martinez. My family has been a pillar of this community for generations." James Harrison stepped forward, placing Margaret Whitmore's diary on the table between them. "A pillar built on disappeared families," the historian said quietly, "on children who vanished without a trace." Sarah Chen activated the digital presentation, zooming in on the photograph's reflection. The detective's laser pointer circled the desperate message etched into the furniture. "Help us!" "These children had names," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Elizabeth and Thomas Whitmore, 7 and 9 years old." The audience fell silent as Rebecca read aloud from Margaret's diary, the final entry describing men arriving before dawn, forcing the family to dress for what would be their last portrait. Blackwood's composure cracked when Sarah revealed Marcus Crane's letter, detailing how he'd been forced to photograph multiple families before their disappearances. His hands trembled as he reached for his water glass. "Your family didn't just collect debts," Rebecca pressed. "They collected people, made examples of them." "You don't understand the times," Blackwood finally said, his voice barely audible. "My great-grandfather built this city from nothing, from the blood of families like the Whitmores," James countered. The breaking point came when Rebecca displayed the list found hidden in the portrait frame. Dozens of names, dates, and amounts. Blackwood's name headed the list of creditors. "It wasn't just then," Blackwood whispered, shoulders slumping. "The system." It continued. "My father taught me which developers to pressure, which politicians to support." He looked up, meeting Rebecca's gaze. "You think it ended a century ago. The methods changed, but the power remained." Gasps rippled through the audience as he described how his family had shaped Boston's development for generations through intimidation, blackmail, and strategic marriages. "We never spoke of the photographs," he admitted, "but they were there, in the private collection. A reminder of what happens to those who challenge the natural order." As security escorted Blackwood from the podium, Rebecca caught Sarah's eye. This wasn't just history anymore. It was a living crime that had never stopped claiming victims. The revelation of the Whitmore family's fate sent shockwaves through Boston's elite. The morning after James Harrison's groundbreaking article was published, protesters gathered outside the mansions of families implicated in the century-old crimes. Signs demanding justice for the Whitmores and return what was stolen lined Commonwealth Avenue, while social media exploded with calls for accountability. Rebecca Martinez watched from her shop window as news vans parked along the street. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing. Journalists, historians, and even Hollywood producers all wanted exclusive rights to the story. She declined them all, insisting this wasn't about fame or profit. Several prominent Boston families issued carefully worded statements through their attorneys, expressing regret for historical allegations, while denying direct knowledge of their ancestors' actions. But the evidence was damning. 3 families announced the creation of substantial restitution funds for descendants of the victims, while another quietly donated the deed to a downtown property once owned by the Whitmores to the Historical Society. Sarah Chen coordinated with the district attorney's office to establish a special task force. Though the statute of limitations had long expired for the original crimes, evidence of ongoing intimidation and financial manipulation created fresh legal avenues. "This isn't just history," she told reporters. "The pattern of silencing continued into our lifetime." On a crisp autumn morning, the trio gathered on the granite steps of the Boston Historical Society. Behind them stood a bronze memorial depicting a family in period clothing, not posed stiffly as in the photograph, but embracing one another in protection and love. The names of 28 families who had disappeared under similar circumstances were engraved on the base. James adjusted his glasses as he addressed the crowd. "Today, we acknowledge not just the victims, but our collective failure to question their absence. How many walked these streets, wondering what happened to the Whitmores, yet said nothing?" When Rebecca stepped to the microphone, her voice was steady but emotional. Edmund and Margaret Whitmore loved their children. They were not just victims of financial predators, but of a society that valued wealth over justice, power over truth. The mayor unveiled a plaque declaring the site the Whitmore Memorial, in honor of those silenced. As cameras flashed, Rebecca noticed an elderly woman in the crowd dabbing her eyes, a distant cousin of the Whitmore children, located through Sarah's diligent research. "The silence ends today," Rebecca said, placing her hand on the memorial, "and the remembering begins." The autumn sun cast long shadows across the Whitmore mansion grounds as Rebecca Martinez, James Harrison, and Sarah Chen returned to the site that had changed their lives forever. 6 months had passed since the revelation that had shaken Boston's elite to its core. The once abandoned estate now bustled with restoration crews, scaffolding embracing the Victorian architecture like a protective cage. "I never thought I'd see this place alive again," Rebecca whispered as they approached the entrance. The antique shop owner ran her fingers along the freshly painted banister, remembering the dust and decay that had greeted her on her first visit. Inside, the transformation was even more dramatic. The grand hall, once shrouded in shadows and cobwebs, now gleamed with polished wood and brass fixtures. Sunlight streamed through meticulously restored stained glass windows, painting the marble floor with kaleidoscopic patterns. The exact spot where the Whitmore family had stood for their fateful portrait was now marked with a simple brass plaque. James adjusted his glasses, emotion evident in his voice. Edmund and Margaret would hardly recognize it. The historian had spent countless hours ensuring the restoration remained historically accurate, honoring the family whose suffering had been silenced for generations. Sarah Chen stood slightly apart, her detective's eyes scanning the space with professional appreciation. The museum board followed every recommendation, she noted, watching as workers carefully positioned display cases containing artifacts from the era. Her involvement had ensured that the exhibition would tell not just the Whitmore story, but those of all the families affected by the creditors' reign of terror. A museum curator approached with reverence, carrying the infamous photograph in its original ornate frame. The image that had once concealed secrets now served as testament to truth uncovered. Rebecca accepted it with steady hands, then walked deliberately to the wall where it had originally hung. "This feels right," she said, as workers secured the portrait in place. The Whitmore family gazed out at them, no longer prisoners of their fate, but witnesses to justice finally served. Visitors began to filter in, historians, journalists, descendants of other affected families. They spoke in hushed tones, pointing to details in the photograph that now told a story everyone could see. The children's mismatched shoes, the father's marked wrists, the reflection that had revealed everything. Rebecca stepped back, watching as people gathered around the portrait. Where once there had been only dust and silence, now there was life and remembrance. The mansion, transformed from a place of hidden horrors to a space of acknowledgement and education, hummed with purpose. "They're not forgotten anymore," James said quietly, standing beside her. Sarah nodded. "And they never will be again." As Rebecca Martinez stood in the restored gallery of the Whitmore mansion, sunlight streaming through the newly cleaned windows, she felt a profound sense of completion. 6 months had passed since the truth had shattered Boston's elite circles. The photograph that had started it all now hung in a place of honor, protected behind museum-grade glass, but visible to all who wished to bear witness. "I never imagined where this would lead," she whispered to James Harrison, who nodded thoughtfully beside her. The historian adjusted his glasses, studying the faces of the Whitmore family with a mixture of respect and sorrow. "History isn't just about what happened, it's about who gets to tell the story," he replied. "For a century, their story was silenced." Sarah Chen joined them, her detective's badge catching the light as she approached. "The district attorney called this morning. 2 more families have come forward with restitution claims against the Blackwood estate," she said, referring to the descendants of Edmund Whitmore's primary creditor. The 3 friends had become something more than colleagues through their shared journey. They had become guardians of a forgotten truth. Rebecca's antique shop had transformed too, now featuring a small exhibition about historical forensics that drew curious visitors from across New England. "Do you ever think about how differently this could have ended?" James asked, his voice low. Rebecca nodded. "Every day. If we had backed down when the threats started," she trailed off, remembering the anonymous calls, the broken window at her shop, the legal letters demanding her silence. "But we didn't," Sarah said firmly. "That's what matters." The museum would open to the public tomorrow, with the Whitmore photograph as its centerpiece. Already, 3 university programs had requested permission to bring students through, and a documentary filmmaker was scheduled to interview the trio next week. Rebecca approached the photograph one last time before they left. The faces of Edmund and Margaret Whitmore seemed different now, no longer just victims frozen in terror, but people whose truth had finally been honored. Their children's eyes, once haunting in their fear, now seemed to hold something like gratitude. "You know what I keep thinking about," Rebecca said as they walked toward the exit. "Margaret's final diary entry, about hoping someone would someday understand what they couldn't say aloud." James placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I think she would be proud of what we've done." Outside, autumn leaves scattered across the mansion's renovated steps. The 3 friends paused, looking back at what they had accomplished. The weight of the past had been heavy, but in carrying it into the light, they had transformed it into something else entirely, not just a resolution, but a reckoning.